Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. We are going to touch just briefly on the end of the book of Ruth, as I mentioned before we finished up last time. Just a couple of comments there on the end, but our main objective today is really to get into the book of Esther. Everybody's got a book. It's okay if you didn't get through the material yet. We're going to spend some time on the introduction, really just the first and beginning of the second chapter. So pretty straightforward to get into the book of Esther. Before we go any further, though, Brother Ben, can I get you to lead our minds in an opening word of prayer? Thank you.
Father in heaven, we understand, Father, that indeed you are holy, that you are awesome, and we're so thankful to be your people. We're thankful, Father, for this time that we have for prayer and for Bible study. Thank you for men like Kevin who are willing to lead. And we pray, Lord, that you will help us to consider the words today as we wrap up Ruth and Esther. Help us, Father, to bear the fruit of the Spirit and be kind and good toward one another and people in the world. And help us, Father, to have the courage as well to stand up and to do what's right for your people and for your cause. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So the book of Ruth, what time frame were we talking about? Just to get our minds stirred back up a little bit. When was the book of Ruth take place? When did that take place?
During the Judges?
During the period of the Judges, right? A very turbulent time. Remember, as we talked about that, and we all know what was going on during the time of the Judges with the people of Israel, the falling away, the idolatry, the immorality, and just a really sad show of God's people after some folks have died after the death of Joshua. Everybody did what was right in their own sight. You remember the statements there. There was no king in Israel, the statements made, but clearly speaking of nobody recognized or honored the sovereignty of the one and true and living God. And they were just doing whatever they wanted to do. So we studied that great book. What's the highlight? What's the jump up to the story? Keep simple with Ruth. Redemption, right? So we have the story of Boaz moves his family to Moab. Boaz dies, his two sons died, and Naomi comes back.
Amalek died.
I'm sorry?
Amalek died.
Amalek, did I say? Oh, I said, well, sorry.
It's
Thank
okay.
you. Yeah, I told you to keep me straight today. Elimelech died. Now I'm all flustered, right? Elimelech died. And so Naomi and Ruth return. Of course, Ruth marries Boaz. He doesn't die yet anyway. And so we have that great story of redemption. What is the nature of Ruth? Throw some things out about Ruth. What was her nature, her character? Loyal, faithful, devoted, loving, kind. I'm sorry, and she was a Moabite, which was there. I think there's clear reason why that was mentioned all the time throughout the book. Ruth the Moabitess, right? Ruth the Moabite. So loving, kind, and faithful, and the things she did for her mother-in-law were incredible. She gave up her land, her family, to come to be with Naomi. Not only that, but what else is said about Ruth? She says, I'm going to do what? Not only I'm going to come with you to be with your people, but what? She was going to worship the God. So she worship the one and only true and living God, Naomi's God. And so clearly she was devoted to not only Naomi, but devoted to the only true and living God. What a great character. What a great story in that time of tribulation in the book of Judges. And we got right to the end of the book, and just a couple thoughts. We were kind of talking about in chapter 4, there toward the end, after we have the story of Boaz and with the elders and with the other redeemer that was closer to him, and we talked about that and the blessings that were given by the elders and the people concerning Boaz and taking Ruth to be his wife. And we see that the Lord blessed them. And she bore a son, right? And how blessed. Here you have a story. You think about it now, the beginning of the story, Naomi considers herself not to be blessed, right? She considers, don't call me blessed, but call me what? Bitter, right? Because of the things that have happened to her. And now we get to the end of the story, and she is quite blessed because now Boaz has redeemed her, and Ruth has bore a son. And what's the connection? And this is where we won't go much farther than this. What is the connection of Ruth and Boaz's son?
Father of Jesse, the father of King David.
All right. Father of Jesse, the father of King David. Matthew chapter 1, verses 5, right? The significance of this story and the significance of the tie-in, I think, of this that is mentioned in the lineage of Christ, right? As we think about this, who was the father of Boaz?
Selling by Rahab.
There you go. Another interesting situation, right? Rahab was who? The harlot.
Saved the spies.
Saved the spies, but she was from what city? Jericho. But not of the tribe of not of Israel, right? So again, another Gentile in the line of Christ. But here we see this lineage being fulfilled here. Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David, the king, as we see the lineage there that's given. So we have this redemption that's going on. They could understand at the time, but also I think this is part of the story. We talk about every book in the Bible does what in regards to Christ. Every book of the Bible points, I mean, especially the Old Testament, right? Points to Jesus Christ. And here we have this type of redeemer, if you will, in Boaz, as pointing to the redeemer that we have in Jesus Christ. So there's a lot of parallels between what Boaz did, and we could look at that, at what Jesus did as our Savior and Redeemer. But significant there as we finish up the book of Ruth. Any comments or questions there? I'm going to move on because I want to get into our next glorious story here, the book of Esther. Let's turn to that. Turn to the book of Esther, and let's talk a little bit about the book of Esther here. We'll go through some introductory information. I put some of that in the material, but I guess the key verse that jumps out, to me, as you think about the book of Esther is what I have on the slide. Here you have the great courage and fortitude. And I think we see the character here of Esther in chapter 4 and verse 16, and says, "Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan," or Susa, depending on your translation, "and fast for me." This is Esther speaking now. "Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." And of course, that's all around what Mordecai has told her to go do in response to what Haman has done with that decree and the intent to destroy all the Jews. And she takes on this role here. And she really, the book of Esther to me is Esther saves the people, right? She saves the nation, and we're gonna think about that as we go through together here in the book of Esther. So from the let's see here. Why isn't my locked up? Let's see. That's not good. What's going on? There we go. Okay, my mistake. My mistake. I got the little pointer up there for later on. Okay, so we studied the book of Ruth the best we could there. This section now is the book of Esther. We're going to study today this introduction and chapters 1 through essentially chapter 2, about verse 15. This is our schedule. You'll notice the visiting speakers have been removed because Kevin's not going to Asia this week. That's been postponed till January, so you'll miss me a couple weeks in January for various reasons. So, and I'm thankful for that. It helps. It's kind of hard, honestly, when you teach and then you don't teach and then you teach again. You kind of lose the flow of what you're trying to accomplish. So even though Ben and Miles will do a wonderful job, and Tim was also going to chime in there. Appreciate that very much. And then the Song of Solomon. So I'm working on finishing up the book, or our workbook, Song of Solomon. So again, we're going to have to cover that fairly quickly. And Joanna's smiling at me. She's probably saying, "You better get that to me in a hurry so that we can get it printed." So you remember again, just to kind of let's set the scene of where we are, right? When we think about the books of the Old Testament and how they're broken down into law, history, and wisdom and prophecy. We're in this section of history, right? So actually, Esther is the final book, if you will, as we think about the history books, the 12 books, beginning there with Joshua and ending with Esther in this particular section, or how we categorize the books. Esther's not necessarily in chronological order, just as Ruth took place during the time of the judges, right? Coming after the judges doesn't mean that the things that we're going to read about did not transpire earlier, which we'll see here as we talk about when these things happen in the book of Esther, I believe that we'll find. So again, just to set our minds, Esther among the 12. So this just helps me frame some of the things and get my mind right. Joshua, the possession of the land, Judges and Ruth. We had that oppression of the nation, but that great story of Ruth and the redemption that were in there. If we look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, we see the stabilization and the expansion of the kingdom under the ruler of the kings, the glorification and the deterioration of the nations as we get into 1st and 2nd Kings, because we have the divided kingdom, we have the evil and the corrupt things that go on in the nation. As we think about Chronicles, we have the preparation, of course, for the building of the temple and some of the things that are captured out of the or repeats or a summary of other things that written in 1st and 2nd Kings, the destruction of the temple, of course, and the final deportation of Judah into the Babylonian captivity. We had Assyria go into captivity earlier. And then we enter into Ezra and Nehemiah. These are the books. What are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther concerned with? They're concerned with the post-exile, right? So the return. We see the return under Cyrus beginning in Ezra and the things that go on there and through Nehemiah. Esther is the protection of the people. Again, the saving of the people. That's how, if somebody asks me, give me 1 or 2 words to explain what's going on in Esther, it's the saving of God's people. I'd add a few things through his providence and control, right? As we read the story of Esther together. If we think about a survey of Esther, this wasn't in the material, but I thought it was a good high-level overview. We have this idea of the treatment of the Jews here beginning, which we're going to study today, which takes us down through about chapter 2, verse 23. We have these feasts that are going on, the feast of Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes or Xerxes. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we have these characters, Vashti, Esther, Mordecai, that are going to come into the scene. The trial of the Jews, again, which makes up the bulk of the book, right, talks about Mordecai, his plot and plans to kill the Jews and the things that go on there. And then at the end, we have the triumph, right? The victory that God gives the Jews through the things that he controls, I believe, through his providence. If you think about, when we read the books of the Old Testament, sometimes you got to wonder, why was that recorded? What was that written for? What's the importance of all of that? But, when I think of some of the statements that we have written, like over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if I can, verse 11, when Paul's writing to Corinth there, he says, now all these things happen unto them for examples. They are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Speaking of the things that took place under the Old Covenant, or the Old Testament. Romans chapter 14 makes another statement, or actually Romans chapter 15, pardon me. Romans chapter 15, and I believe it's verse 4, as soon as I can figure out which direction to go on my Bible here. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, and we through patience, comfort of the scriptures might have hope. Right? Interesting. So you got people speculate. The book of Esther has a lot of interesting, if you're into reading external sources from the scriptures and about the canonization of the scriptures and what was accepted, what people argue against. One of the things in Esther is, yeah, it's a great story. People think they call it a love story, right? But why do you think it's challenged? What is not mentioned in Esther, which causes some to challenge early or maybe early in the first, second century and throughout the ages? What is not mentioned in the book of Esther? God, right? And that has caused a lot of people to think that, well, what's it really doing in here? But if you really think about the book and what's going on, God is on every page, right? As we think about what? His providence, right? His control and what's going on here, and where this story fits in. So what jumps up about the book of Esther to you?
Well, a couple of thoughts. Both Ruth and Esther, I mean, they're fantastic stories. There's so much emphasis today on story and storytelling, but thinking about these stories, these are great to read to our children and just seeing God at work. And I think the courage of Esther, I think it says a lot for women and what she was able to do. So those are a couple of thoughts that stand out to me. Obviously, I think chapter 4, you mentioned,
Right.
If I perish, I perish. One of the best statements ever said. So, but just seeing how God is able to work, it doesn't matter what plans man has, like Haman.
Right.
God is the one that's still gonna provide for us people in unlikely ways that we could never imagine.
He will accomplish his plans. He is in control, right? Yeah, and we'll make a few mentions of the book of Daniel and how that ties in to what's going on in this time period. That we might have comfort, that we might have hope. Think about. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but you know what? If Esther didn't save the nation, I find it hard that Nehemiah would have been able to get back to Jerusalem to do what? Finish the building of the wall, because we'll see in Ezra chapter 7, we believe Esther, I believe Esther took place between the gap in Esther 6 after they finished the temple in 516, and then we have Ezra in chapter 7. Remember, and going back, and he is the what to the king? He is the cupbearer to the king, and that's the following king. That's not Xerxes. That's Artaxerxes the first. So if Esther didn't save the people, it's likelihood if the Jews were destroyed, guess who wasn't going back? Ezra, Nehemiah. None of that would have probably happened if God hadn't intervened and controlled the situation. So those are great stories of hope. Again, there's God over all pages if you will, of the book. I just listed some things. Think about the providence. Is there anything that jumps out to you if you've read through the book or just from memory, actually? What are the things that jump out showing the providence of God? JD?
Well, so that jumped out to me, probably not what you were looking for, but I kind of like how Haman's big plan of like precisely how he was going to get rid of the Jews and his execution method of that plan was quite literally turned against him at the very end. Like how he planned to kill the Jews was the exact way he was killed.
That's a great use of an interesting word. Remember, T started with a T. It was turned.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to talk about that in a second. Great passage in chapter 9. It was turned. The things that were transpiring were turned around by God through his providence and the things that were going on. What else jumps out as providence in the book that you can recall, man?
Book of Records in chapter 7 about what Mordecai had done and how the king is he couldn't sleep and he's reading this, and so these things come back to his remembrance.
Interesting. Remember. Okay, so at the end of chapter 2, we have Mordecai that hears about this plot. Remember, tells Esther, saves the king. We don't see much. Okay, that was fine. It was recorded. Then we get into to see what Haman's up to. Right. One night the king can't sleep. He's got insomnia. Interesting, huh? Asked for the Chronicles of the King. I was listening to somebody, Ben made a good joke. He says, just like if you can't sleep, you can read some of my sermons. Right? But the king had insomnia, couldn't sleep, asked for the cross, and it just so happens, what did he turn to and read? About Mordecai. Interesting, isn't it? By chance? I don't think so.
The fact that
Right.
the plot became known to Mordecai.
The fact that the plot became known, right? You're bringing out good stuff, right? Mordecai was made aware of the plot. How about the casting of lots, the pure? You think? There you go.
Would provide time for things to unfold.
You remember that he did that in the first month. Haman was doing that, and then determined that, okay, we're going to do this on the 13th day of the 12th month. So we got 11 months essentially, or almost a full year before this was going to execute. And we see now what executes in that first 3 months and gives him time, gives God time to work his magic, if you will, his providence. What else do you see? Anything else? What else? The statement in chapter 4 by Mordecai, when he's talking to or sending a message back to Esther. You remember what he says there in chapter 4? Is it? I'm not going to quote it. There you go. Who knows, right? It's in
Verse 14.
Thank you. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, again, this is Mordecai talking to Esther about not going to speak to the king, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise for the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shalt be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? We're sorry, reading from the King James there. So Mordecai definitely had, I believe, confidence in God. Shows that he believes in the confidence of, or providence of God here, right? As he speaks that. Who knows? This may be your calling, if you will. Take courage and do these things as we see that. And so I put a bunch of, let's see I think we hit a lot of them. We talked about, Esther being chosen as queen. What happens when she's brought into the house of the king, the house of the women of the king? Does she find favor immediately? She does, right? And so we see that taking place. The casting of lots, Mordecai discovers the plot. We just talked about chapter 4. The king's welcome of Esther. She hadn't been in front of him in 30 days. And so this is what she was worried about. Hey, if I go in front of the king and he hadn't called me, you know what the penalty is? If he doesn't like it, it's death. And so we see the king. I think, again, we just see God's hand in all this. The king's patience with her and her banquets, right? We see the king's insomnia we talked about, the king's lapse of memory and the recalling of Mordecai, the king's deep concern for the welfare of Esther, etc. So we see these things, and it's all over the book of Esther, right? It's just, of course, it's always easy to see in hindsight, granted, right? As they were going through this, it might have been harder to see, but as we can sit here and read and see the things that were happening, there's a lot of people that talk about chance around this, but this wasn't chance. This was God's hand in controlling the situation.
Any indication of how old Esther was?
No, the term, I think, young virgin, I'm assuming she was teenagers, maybe late teenagers, mid to late teenage. That's my best guess. I don't think I've read anybody on what they thought, how old she was, right? But
It speaks volumes, knowing how
Her
young.
character?
yeah, her character and her wisdom. One of the things I thought about her, when we talk about her character and wisdom, when she went after she'd been through her 12 months and talking about a spa treatment, right? 12 months. I might be in for that, right? But after her preparation before going into the king, what did she ask? They said that they could take anything that they wanted, right? And to help them to please the king. But what did she do? She asked for nothing. She asked, I say, for only take the things that she should from the I forget his name. Starts with an M. Sorry, it's my brain. Yeah, thank you. From the ones that looked over the women, the eunuch that looked over the women there. And so she had some wisdom, I think, right? She showed great wisdom. And I'm just gonna say it now, we could really get downtrodden in talking about Mordecai, why he allowed this, why she participated in this, right? And there's so much written that pulls down both Mordecai and Esther. But we got to remember the situation, what's going on. They were in captivity, right? I don't see any indication of that, right? I think we see indication of faithfulness to God. Certainly, they chose not to return. We'll talk about that in a second. But here we see that God allowed this, he permitted it, and he used it, right? He used it for good, right? He saved his nation. Even though, yeah, the group of folks that stayed back, right, in the land of captivity didn't choose to return to rebuild the temple. Now we know the line of the Christ was not going to come from these folks. It was going to come through those that had returned back, of course, to Jerusalem. But they were still God's people. He still cared for them, even though that they were in the situation of captivity, as we've seen it. One of the things I wanted to bring up, and JD made mention of this, turn over to chapter 9. And I got it up on the screen, so you can turn over, we can just read it together there. And I use the New American Standard because I like the wording of that. So think about what's written in chapter 9. And this, again, speaks to the theme and what's going on in God's control. And so in chapter 9, it says, now in the 20th month, that is month of Adar, on the 13th day when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them. Okay, you remember the story, right? So Haman's edict had went out. They were supposed to destroy the Jews on the 13th day. That all turned around. Mordecai has now sent out a new decree for them to protect themselves. But look, it was turned to the contrary so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those that hated them. You see that? It was turned, right? God turned it, not chance. It was turned by God. Drop down to verse 22, and he says, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was, and this is talking about Purim now, which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into holiday, right, or celebration. Right? And so that's what God did by his hand. He turned the situation around. He's able to do that. He has all power. He is sovereign, right? And again, even though these folks were still in the land of their captivity, right, he was still watching over them. And we'll talk about it in a minute here. As I already made mention that if God didn't save, if Esther didn't do the things that she did through the providence and control of God, of course, he could have taken care of it a different way. There's no doubt about it. Don't get me wrong. But if the nation wasn't saved, we'd have some troubles because there's still some things that need to go on in Jerusalem until the time of Christ, of course. And if this didn't happen, I think we'd have significant issues here. Outline of the book is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to stop there. I'm not going to stop there and spend any time on that. But the background, the time frame, and we think about the title, Esther, named after the main character. Tell me a little bit about the name of Esther. What was the other name? So Esther is what name? Is that the Greek or the Hebrew?
It's a Persian name.
Sorry. See, I wasn't either of those. That was not a trick question. That was
The Greek's not there yet.
thankful. Is a Persian name, meaning what? What does Esther mean? Anybody remember? Star, right? Her Hebrew name was what? Hadassah, if I get the Hebrew right. Meaning what? Remember? Anybody know what that means? Myrtle. Oh, it's on the screen. Sorry. Sorry. Don't pay attention to that. It means myrtle, right? It's a fragrant evergreen plant, and it had star-shaped flowers, right? Interesting tie-in maybe with her Persian name. It talks about, it conveys this idea of beauty, righteousness, resilience. And there's also another thing that it conveys as you look at some of those that are experts in the Hebrew, but it also talks about something that's hidden. That this Hadassah, this myrtle, this name conveys something that's hidden, a hidden potential within, right? Which ties right into some of the things that we see happening in Esther doesn't reveal that she's a Jew, right? There's some things that are hidden there. She was humble, right? She was wise, she was righteous, certainly resilient in her life. But we see these things as we go through. So the title, the book of Esther, the authorship is your guess is as good as mine. People talk about Mordecai, people talk about Ezra, people talk about Nehemiah. According to some of the Jewish historians, the Great Synagogue wrote the book. So there's a bunch of, I don't know, right? I don't know, but what do we know, right? This is what I think we know about the author. I think he was a Jew, right? And we can go through and we could see that by the things that he does and how he carries himself and the things that he says, his knowledge of the Jewish customs, the things that were going on. But also someone living in Persia. He knew very much about what is going on in the kingdom there in Persia, the customs, the rules, the regulations. So I don't know who it is, but it's certainly defined by those three things, I think. And you can tell me who you think it is, but I don't know. The date ranges from 455 to 200 BC. Typically, the modernists want a later date for various reasons. I think it was written probably around 400-ish. Not that really matters, but it's just some information for you to chew on. Think about the audience here. Now, we've talked about the theme and the purpose of the book a little bit. Who's the audience that would be reading this?
Jewish nation.
The Jewish nation, both in captivity, both those that are back in Palestine, right? Future generations. There's going to be a few more changes in regimes, right? We're only in the Medo-Persian. Who's next? Greece, and then Rome, right? According to Daniel, right? So they could read this book. You think about they could read this book. They could see how God intervened, saved his people, etc. And again, just brings hope, I think, for future generations there. The time frame of the book, and we're going to get into this a little bit deeper here. How's my time doing? I believe it covers about 10 or 11 years, and we can see that by the timestamps in the book, right? From when we have the opening feast at about 483-ish, if you will, till the end in the 12th year, when the things that are going on when they implement the feast, Purim, etc. So it's about a decade or so. I believe it happens between the book in Ezra, between the situation where they've completed the temple in about 516 BC, and before we have Ezra returning there in chapter 7, and he is the cupbearer of the king, and he goes back to Palestine for the first time, and so taking place. This is not a new place. Susa, Shushan, right? Of course. As we read through our Bibles, we haven't got to Daniel and some of the other mentions of the palace here, but this is Susa or Shushan. This is the royal residence during that time. It's actually his winter palace, as I've done some research on that. So he actually stayed there in the winter, too hot in the summertime, so there were other palaces. But all the things that are happening during this particular time frame, specifically in this period of time, we see it recorded here being taken place at this particular location. So let's think about let's get into some of the text now. And let's read, actually, if I could get a reader, I'm going to try to make sure nobody has to read anything crazy hard on names. So fair warning, I won't ask you that. I need somebody to read verses 1 through 9, and let's get into some more of the text. JD, you want to hit it? All right, take off, my friend. 1 through 9, please.
All right. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia.
Mhm.
In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, capital, that in the third year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia, the Media, and the nobles, and the princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the capital, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officials of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women of the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus.
Ahasuerus. Good job. Thank you. So this sets the story, right? So in the 3rd year of the king Ahasuerus, and so one of our questions, I've got a few of them up on the board, but what's the other name for Ahasuerus? Xerxes. The Septuagint says Artaxerxes, actually. The Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so this Ahasuerus or Xerxes or Artaxerxes is the king that we're talking about. I'm going to jump back and forth here a little bit. But as we think about where this fits in, from the kings of Persia. So we had Cyrus, you remember, under Cyrus, we have the beginning of the return. Cyrus, where do we find and read about the fall of Babylon? Daniel chapter 5, right? I think, is that right? Yeah. Check me on that. Yeah. Daniel chapter 5, right? We have the fall of the Babylonian kingdom. We have Cyrus coming on board as the Persian ruler. After that, Cambyses and Guamata, there's some stories about them that we're not going to get into, but during the period of Ezra 4, and then we have Darius coming onto the scene about 522, which we read about in Ezra chapter 5 and chapter 6, and we're talking about now Ahasuerus, ruled from 486 BC to 465, 464-ish. And that's the period of time. So that's the king that's under rule here during the book of Esther, Esther chapter 1 through 10. Then Artaxerxes, right? The first is the next king. And we see him come up in Ezra 7 and through Nehemiah, right? And so he's the following king after Ahasuerus. So that helps us as we think about where we are. And this is proven secular history, right? So we have good references on the kings and who they are and when they were. So these references match up. Sometimes the change of words of Ahasuerus to Artaxerxes to Xerxes, right? Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes are sometimes pointed to as titles versus a proper name. Here we have Xerxes is the Greek. Here, Greek. Did I say that again wrong? Yeah. No, that is Greek. Xerxes is Greek, if I remember. It's his Persian name, but I think the history of that is, or the background of that is Greek. But anyway, so this is the time period that we're under as we think about the name of Ahasuerus and when. Where in the book of Daniel and Ezra is Ahasuerus mentioned, and is this the same name as the Ahasuerus of Esther 1 and 1? Does anybody know in the book of Daniel where he's mentioned? This is a complicated question. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it.
There's several of these men at the same time.
Yeah. So chapter 9 and 1, end of chapter 5 and chapter 6, a couple places in the book of Daniel. The problem, and I really don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I'm not sure I can completely defend a position on it, honestly, to tell you the truth. If you want to read all the positions, I refer you to the Truth Commentary on Daniel, written by well, my brain is gone. Anyway, the Truth Commentary, I can't remember who wrote it, but there's a lot of positions given on who this Darius was. But in chapter 9 of Daniel, verse 1, it says, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus. Okay, that's not, if you read it like that and think of, wait a minute, I thought Darius' son was Ahasuerus, or the following king was Ahasuerus. So there's some complexity in understanding who that was. I don't think that's the same Ahasuerus as being spoken of here, but where is he mentioned in Ezra? You know where this is mentioned in Ezra? This king? Any?
4:6.
4:6 is one of the mentions. No, I'm not. Are you sure 4:6, or how about 3:7? Is that?
Yeah, 4:6.
Is it 4:6? Am I reading the wrong? So hey, so hey, tech went forth. I'm not seeing it in 4:6. Am I in the wrong book? You and Esther, right? You're not Daniel, right?
Is it?
Ezra.
Ezra. Should I sit down now? I'm sorry, Ezra. I'm sorry. You're you're right. I'm in the wrong book. 4:6. You're right. My bad. And the reign of Ahasuerus. So do you remember the context here? That's true. I'm a mess. But in chapter 4 of Ezra, verses 5 and 6, and even to 7, it's talking about several kings here, starting with Cyrus, ending up with Artaxerxes. And you remember that the people of Palestine were writing to these kings to do what? To those that were working in Palestine, to trouble. Remember? They wrote to trouble the rebuilding of the temple, to trouble the rebuilding of the wall. And here we have a statement that talks about this went on even during the period that we're speaking of time, the king of Ahasuerus. Okay. And that would have been during that particular period. So we get to remember the stall that happened in the end of chapter 4 of Ezra of the work there in about 520 BC. If you turn over a page into chapter 6 and verse 15, and this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month, Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So this gives us a mention of Darius now, not particularly Ahasuerus. But it gives, I wanted to get us through these timestamps. So we have Ahasuerus mentioned in Ezra 4. We have now the king before him, Darius, mentioned in chapter 6 and verse 15, which is 516 BC. Then in chapter 7 and verse 7 on the same page or the next page over, you can see we have our Artaxerxes, the king, being mentioned. And this is the time when Ezra makes his return. So it's between that time frame that we're speaking of the particular story of Esther. Again, sorry for my confusion on that one. I totally went blank. What were the 127 provinces of Persia, and where on the map are they located? And so I should have done this better, but I don't know why I didn't put my map up there. I beg your pardon. Okay, so here's a map. Okay, this is the Persian Empire. As you can see up here, between about 530 and 330, that the Greece defeated, the Greeks defeated in 330, 331, the Persian Empire. But this is a picture of the Persian Empire. It was a pretty great nation. Susa, the palace, if I can see, is right over to the left, about right there. Sorry, my eyes aren't working. So that's the area that we're speaking of when we're talking about in Shushan or Susa, the palace in this area. But it's great. These are the 127 provinces that's being spoken of. And you'll see it's inclusive of Palestine, where those that have decided to return to rebuild the temple and rebuild the wall and reestablish the city there are at. So it's quite large. As we think about the Persian Empire, and let me go backward here and talk about a few things. There's a timeline that I'll put up here, and maybe it'll be helpful to you, and maybe it won't be, but it is to me. It kind of shows you the period that we're talking about. This period of Esther happened under Xerxes, right? Darius, the king before, when the temple was completed in about 516, and also during the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah. You remember that, but it's this period in between the completion of the temple and about when Ezra returns to Jerusalem, which is in chapter 7 of Ezra. Okay, so it's that about 58-year period between that is when we have this 10-year period of Esther. And so as we think about this, the opening that JD read, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus that this was the Ahasuerus reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. India, and that corresponds. India is down here. Ethiopia is over here. Some translation, Ethiopia is over here. If you see my little cursor there, India being referenced over here. Sometimes this is called Cush or some other translations, but it's talking again about the great scope of the Persian Empire that we have before us, and as we see before us here in the book of Esther. 3 feasts are going on. Interesting. A little bit of background on the king here. He was known for several things. He was known to be impulsive. Do you see that in this book? If you read some of the historians, it talks about his impulsive nature, his prideful nature. It talks about his lavish parties and feasts and the things that are going on here. But here we have in the 3rd year, if you write in your Bible, in the 3rd year of his reign is about 483 BC. All right, so we believe he started in about 486 BC as king. But here in the 3rd year, about 43, we have this great feast that's going on here. Now, that's some feast. How many days did it last for? Okay, that's a long time. That is a long time. And we see, as JD read, we see what he's doing here. What is he doing in verse 4? He's showing the riches of his kingdom, his excellent majesty. And so this pomp and circumstance that was going on for 180 days, I couldn't even fathom that kind of party, I guess, and the situation around that. But it's thought, just a historical note, there's a reason that he has assembled his leaders. That's the first feast, right? There's a reason that he assembled his leaders here. And if you read the history, it's thought, and it ties in together, is that he was preparing to make an attack on Greece. And that's actually what happens between chapter 1 and chapter 2. After Vashti is disposed and removed, then we begin in chapter 2. I did pretty good. We begin in chapter 2. That's after he gets utterly defeated by the Greeks. His father was utterly defeated 10 to 15 years before. This great feast that he's having is in preparation of that. He's showing his wealth. He's getting everybody lined up. It's written that they believe they were planning for this great attack. He goes off. The things happen with the queen here. He comes back from being totally annihilated. It's said that his army was anywhere from 3 million to 5 million strong, and he came back with 5,000. Right, so they were utterly annihilated. And so can you not imagine in chapter 2, after these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti? After he just got his clock cleaned, if you will, and utterly defeated, he's come back, and now he's thought of, maybe I was a little bit impulsive. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And so that is a transition we'll talk about more in this book. We have these 3 feasts. We have this big 180-day feast. We have a 7-day feast that's after that with all the people, right? So he gets all the people. And in the King James Version, if you want to know the translation of what it means, the king was married with wine, that means he was absolutely inebriated, right? He was drunk. And we have this situation. What does he do? What he's showing off his kingdom and all of his riches, all is going. Now, who does he want to show off? Let's show off his wife, right? Calls for the queen, and we didn't get the chance to read that, but in verse 11, he says, "Bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look upon." Again, a lot of conjecture of exactly what that meant, right? And what he really asked her to do. And we're going to pick up there next week and plow through the next lesson. Appreciate your comments. Hope it was beneficial. Looking forward to next week.